Morning. My name is Carissa Tucker, and today I'm going to be sharing my reflections on anticipatory grief. Grief is not something people ask or want, although it is expected. It can be heartbreaking news when friends or acquaintances experience loss, but it is entirely different when it happens to you. Yet I believe what makes grief so difficult is not necessarily when it happens, but the why and how it happens. Grief can be cruel, it can be unexpected, it can be gruesome, it can even be exhausting. It can also bring relief, but it still carries some aspect of pain and hurt. When it comes to anticipatory grief, does it make the process of mourning easier, faster, better, or worse? In this reflection, I will be sharing indications of anticipatory grief, as well as analyze whether these clues shorten the bereavement process. In addition, I will share a personal experience on this type of grief. I will close with my thoughts on how I would counsel someone who is experiencing anticipatory grief. Most of this reflection will be my thoughts, but I will include one reference: Warden's text, Grief Counseling and Grief Therapy, a handbook for the mental health practitioner to support terms and definitions. Warden defines anticipatory grief as the absence of overt manifestations of grief at the actual time of death in survivors who already experience the phases of normal grief and who free themselves from the emotional ties with the deceased. Prior to the loss of a loved one, the soon-to-be survivor displays some of the following 6 signs: denial, high levels of anxiety, sensitivity to their future death, role rehearsal, as Warden states, detaching their feelings early, and last, the survivor can overmanage the patient's medical care, as Warden shares. Although the survivor is aware of the anticipated demise, he or she can still experience denial, the first indication, and question whether the outcome will really take place. The act of denial can be twofold. It can be helpful for the survivor to deal early with the first task of mourning, which is accepting the reality of the loss, but it can also affect the survivor, causing them to have that hope that anticipated results will reverse. The individual can also experience higher levels of anxiety, which is a second sign, which Warden says are generally associated with post-death bereavement. This escalation of anxiety is based on 2 things, as Warden states: the length of period of anticipatory grief and the person's proximity to death. Given this information, the anticipation of grief can have a negative effect on the individual dependent on these variables, which in turn offers the same results in post-death outcomes. Thus, this leads me to share on the 3rd sign, where the individual is sensitive or overly aware of his or own future death. Observing the anticipated death of a loved one can cause a survivor to contemplate his or own mortality, leading to further increase in anxiety. A 4th sign is role rehearsal, which Warden connects this with the 3rd task of mourning, where the survivor positions himself or herself in a world from which the deceased is missing. It is here where the individual will play out various scenarios or possible outcomes without the loved one in the picture. In the medical field, physicians have called this the work of worry, allowing the individual to verbally work out his or her worry to better prepare his or herself. The response and result from this sign can have both a positive and negative feedback, but overall it seems to lean toward a more positive one. The 5th indicator is when the survivor detaches too early during the anticipatory grief period, because he or she knows what is to come. Fully removing his or herself from the equation appears to be a good approach in their mind. Consequently, this can have an adverse effect on the terminally ill, causing him or her to feel uncomfortable. Instead of cherishing those last few days, weeks, or months with the loved one, the survivor can fast forward too quickly. Warden says this usually happens when the anticipatory grief is too long a time period. If this occurs, it seems this attempt might not be the best approach, nor possibly a helpful one. The final indicator is the opposite of the 5th, in which the survivor responds with an overbearing approach and moves too close to the dying patient, as Warren says. Reacting in this manner can be a loving approach the survivor extends to their sick loved one, but it can also mask their ambivalent feelings toward the dying person and the guilt of such feelings, as Warden aptly shares. Without the individual realizing he or she is overcompensating their actions toward their sick loved one. Although this seems to be a good method in anticipatory grief, a closer look would be helpful in revealing any underlying motivations the survivor may have. It seems this is not always the result, but it is a case-by-case analysis in determining this. Given all the indicators, along with their benefits and risks, Warden says the time preceding the death can be used very effectively and can have an important impact on the subsequent grief if the survivor is encouraged to take care of unfinished business. He shares that unfinished business does not simply mean wills and matters of estate, but being able to express both appreciation and disappointment, things that need to be said before the person dies. A person cannot control every variable and outcome when it comes to anticipatory grief, but clearing the air, having honest conversations before the loved one departs would be a healthy method. Additionally, support groups can be helpful in surrounding oneself with like-minded individuals, and it is especially useful, as Warden articulates, of parents who lose young children because of terminal illness. On a more personal note, let me share an experience I had with anticipatory grief regarding my late grandmother. Her death did not come as a surprise when I received the phone call sometime in February of 2020. Unbeknownst to us, this would be the month before the world would be dramatically affected by COVID-19. Her death was not a result of COVID, rather the aftermath of 2 strokes, which began deteriorating her body little by little. I believe 2015 marked her first stroke, with her second one in 2018, impairing her body movements, eating habits, and speech. From 2018 to 2020, she lived in an assisted living home close to my mother's home, so she could be attentive to her daily and weekly needs. My sister and family lived in Pennsylvania, and still do, while I was residing in Southeast Asia with my husband and son, long before and during my grandmother's health issues. My anticipatory grief encapsulated 2 areas: proximity and early withdrawal of feelings. Given the distance of our home and visiting Texas once a year, solidify this unconscious detachment toward her. As a caveat, although my grandmother was a part of my life since birth, we were never close, relationally and spiritually. I believe these were added factors to my current feelings at the time. With all that said, because it was a good 5 years before she passed, I knew the inevitable was going to happen. So I chose to cherish those moments I had with her, however long it was going to be, but also detached slowly as the months and years passed. In all honesty, because I anticipated her death, although not desirous of it, I felt I was well prepared for the sad news of her death when my sister told me about it. My immediate response concerned funeral arrangements and whatever else I could do to help, especially since we live far away from Texas. As I reflect, the help of anticipatory grief prepared me well, both mentally and emotionally, in the loss of my grandmother. As I close, I think counseling anyone experiencing anticipatory grief would need to be handled on a case-by-case situation. I would sympathize with the client, given my experience, but would leave this aside, understanding he or she is different, a different person with a unique experience. I would want to hear their story and their journey with a sick loved one to better assess his or her situation. I would be observant and cognizant of any signs or indicators connected to anticipatory grief, which would give me a clearer picture on how to respond to their situation. Above all else, I would be sensitive and understanding to their feelings and help them the best way I could. Well, thank you so much for your time, for listening to me share about anticipatory grief, its risks and benefits, my take on it from a personal experience with my grandmother, and what I would do if I were counseling someone with it. Thank you.